God on trial, self unquestioned. There is a dialogue that shows up everywhere now. Dating shows, podcasts, group chats, confessionals disguised as flirting. A man opens with strategy and certainty. Someone is hands down the top choice, and the plan is to fight for that connection. A woman asks about conflict, and the answer comes back with a grin. Bring it on. A good argument is healthy, and sometimes it even leads to make-up sex. Then the pivot arrives, as it often does. Family values. A father a shining example. Parents still together, 30 years. Then the spiritual probe. Religion, God, belief. The woman calls herself spiritual, not committed, not against it, just not central. The man says he has a personal, quiet relationship with God, and it gives reassurance. Then the grief drops into the room like a stone. The mother died. Colon cancer, 10 years, spreading, torturous, tumors, poisoning the body to fight it, and the mind recoils from the images. A brother's question becomes the mind's indictment. How could a God exist who would allow this? The speaker anticipates the usual coping scripts, purpose, strength, lessons, meaning, and rejects them as hollow. The listener praises the vulnerability, respects the depth, appreciates the intimacy, and celebrates how safe it feels to share. This exchange is a perfect specimen. It looks intimate, conscious, emotionally mature. But metaphysically, it is doing something very specific and very common. Here is the quiet move that happens over and over in dialogues like this. God is put on trial. The self is never questioned. The assumption underneath the grief is not only, how could God allow this? It is, my interpretation of reality must be correct, and God must answer to it. That is already the ego speaking. Because notice what never gets examined. The belief that the body is who the mother was. The belief that suffering proves meaninglessness. The belief that death is an injustice rather than a release. The belief that love requires presence in form. The belief that God creates bodies and diseases rather than life itself. Instead of questioning those assumptions, God gets anthropomorphized into a negligent manager of the universe, and then put in the dock. From a metaphysical lens, especially a coarse lens, the question flips entirely. How could God have created suffering if suffering is not real? That sounds offensive to the ego, but it is actually merciful. Because if suffering were real, then God would indeed be cruel. The only way God remains love is if pain is not creation, but perception. And that is the line the ego will not cross. So the mind says, God let this happen, rather than, what did I believe myself to be? The mother did not become cancer. She did not turn into tumors. She was not reduced to a body being poisoned. That was a body story the mind used to locate love in form, and then mourn its loss. And here is the part that feels brutal until it suddenly feels sane. Wanting her to stay in that condition is not love. It is attachment disguised as grief. Grace is not the continuation of suffering. Grace is the end of it. But the ego cannot accept that, because the ego needs loss to be meaningful. Without loss, it has no story. Without tragedy, it has no depth. Without pain, it has no identity. So it spiritualizes the wound instead. Notice how quickly the conversation moves to personal relationship with God, quiet reassurance, respect for depth, and feeling safe sharing. This is not intimacy with truth. It is bonding over shared assumptions. A special relationship dressed in vulnerability. God becomes a background character, invoked when tragedy strikes, ignored when things are fine. An emotional utility, not a source. That is why personal relationship with God often just means God agrees with the current worldview and comforts the mind inside it. But God does not console illusions. God undoes them. And that is the real terror here. Because if God is real, then the body was never the mother. Then nothing essential was lost. Then the horror was not ordained, it was misperceived. Then death did not win. Then suffering was not meaningful. And if suffering is not meaningful, the ego has nothing left to stand on. So yes, people question God endlessly, but almost no one asks the only question that matters. What must be believed about the self for this to make sense? That is the doorway. And the ego will circle it forever rather than step through. Now go one level deeper. Because the ego is not merely asking a theological question, it is protecting a metaphysical investment. The investment is this: reality must be organized so that innocence can be lost, love can be threatened, and identity can be proven by pain. The ego needs a universe where harm is possible, because only then can protection feel rational. Only then can control feel holy. Only then can fear feel like wisdom. This is why the body is so central in these conversations. The body gives the ego a canvas. A body can be wounded. A body can be taken. A body can be punished. A body can be defended. And if the body is the self, then tragedy becomes ultimate and unquestionable. Then the mind can say, "Look what happened," and never ask, "What am I?" But metaphysics is not interested in refining the tragedy story. Metaphysics is interested in withdrawing belief from the premises that make tragedy seem final. That is why the deepest correction is not, "God had a reason." The deepest correction is, God did not author the premise. God did not author a self that can be invaded. God did not author a life that can be threatened. God did not author love that depends on a bloodstream, a scan, a diagnosis, or a calendar. So what is actually happening when the mind says, "How could God allow this?" The mind is using God as a witness for the prosecution to confirm the body's reality. If God can be blamed, then the world must be real. If the world is real, then separation must be real. If separation is real, then guilt becomes justified. And if guilt is justified, punishment becomes logical. This is the machinery running underneath the tears. This is why the ego prefers the courtroom to the altar. Because an altar ends the argument. A courtroom preserves it. The ego does not fear God's anger. The ego fears God's innocence. Because innocence cancels the entire case. It cancels the idea that something real happened to what is real. It cancels the idea that love can be damaged. It cancels the idea that suffering has authority. It cancels the idea that death has jurisdiction. And then the ego loses its primary currency, grievance. Grievance is not just resentment. Grievance is identity. Grievance is proof that something is wrong out there, which means the self is justified in here. So when the brother asks, "How could God let this happen?" it is not only grief speaking. It is an entire self-concept trying to survive. Because if the mind asked the deeper question, "How could God create this?" it would have to consider the unbearable alternative. That the suffering was not authored by love. That the horror was not a decree. That the images were not the truth of the mother. That the mother was never inside the body in the first place. And that what is loved cannot die. This is where the ego panics and rushes in with spiritual cosmetics. Quiet relationship, reassurance, purpose, strength. All of it can be used as a sedative that avoids the real correction. Because the real correction is not sentimental. It is surgical. It does not say, "Everything happens for a reason." It says, "The reason the world seems to happen is because the mind believes it left its source." And then it offers the only healing that is stable. Not better outcomes in the dream. Not a kinder version of cancer. Not a more inspirational tragedy. But an undoing of the belief that reality is located in the dream at all. This is why the special relationship theme matters here. Because the ego uses intimacy as a hiding place. It uses being deep as a substitute for being honest. It uses sharing pain as a way to make pain sacred. It uses tenderness as a way to keep the premise unquestioned. Two people can feel closer than ever while jointly reinforcing the belief that God failed them. That is not communion. That is a pact. A pact to keep the body story as the foundation. And as long as the body story is the foundation, the question, "What am I?" will remain too dangerous to ask. So the ego will keep returning to the same, safer question, how could God? Because how could God keeps the self intact. But what am I dissolves the self that needs protection. And when the self that needs protection dissolves, the entire concept of God as an afterthought dissolves with it. Because God is not a comfort item added to a life. God is life. And life does not bargain with death. Life simply remains. That is why the doorway is so quiet. No theatrics, no courtroom speeches, just the willingness to let the premise be questioned. Not, why did this happen? But what must be believed for this to be real? That is the moment the argument ends. That is the moment the special relationship stops being a shelter for shared illusions and becomes a classroom for a shared awakening. That is the moment grief can be honored without being worshipped. And that is the moment God is no longer an afterthought, because separation is no longer a thought worth keeping.